Hello, and welcome back to Tales of Two Cities podcast. I'm Nikki, and in our last episode, we took a peek into the dark side of Edinburgh. As I mentioned before, I spent a good chunk of September overseas, exploring the UK and hearing stories that were both interesting and horrifying. I walked through graveyards and through old buildings with stories that were shocking, spine-tingling, and alarming. This is one such story.
Hello? Welcome.
This is the Two Cities.
Oh, I'm so excited.
In Edinburgh in 1828, something sinister was happening. You see, in the early 19th century, Edinburgh was bursting with scientific inquiry. Many anatomy teachers, including Alexander Monro, John Bell, John Goodsir, and Robert Knox, men cited to this day for their contributions to the modern understanding of the physical body, were working in Edinburgh. Their work, combined with work being done in the Netherlands and Italy, helped shape the field of surgery. Though, in order to better understand anatomy and create protocol for surgery, one must practice. And of course, the best way to practice is on a human body, a cadaver. In particular, the work of Robert Knox was notable in this case. Knox was an anatomist by training and became qualified as a doctor in 1814. Knox himself was blind in one eye and badly disfigured after contracting smallpox as a child. After serving as an army physician in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, he took a post in England for a short time and then worked in the Cape Frontier War in 1819 in southern Africa, before settling in his hometown of Edinburgh in 1820. In 1825, Knox became a fellow at the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh, where he became a lecturer of anatomy. He conducted dissections twice a day at the college and promised a, quote, full demonstration on fresh anatomical subjects as part of every course he taught. His lectures often drew as many as 400 students. He was well known both as a teacher and a researcher. He's been noted for almost single-handedly increasing the study of anatomy in Britain. As these scientists, such as Knox, continued to work diligently in developing surgical techniques, many came to study under them. Medical schools were in desperate need of cadavers. Scottish law stated that the suitable bodies for use for dissection were those of prisoners, suicide victims, and bodies of foundlings and orphans. Of course, with the high demand of training under these prestigious doctors, there was soon a shortage of corpses for students and lecturers to utilize. Intuitive businessmen saw a high demand but low supply. They quickly formed a gruesome and immoral plan. Medical schools were in need of what many cemeteries had. These men, called resurrection men, began to rob fresh graves to sell the bodies to medical schools. Medical schools would pay high prices, higher depending on the season. During the summer months, bodies were sold for around £8, what would be £1,024 today, or around $1,300. In winter, they went for more, as decomposition was slowed and bodies could be stored for longer by anatomists. In winter, one could expect £10, £1,280 today, or more than $1,600 US. Soon, exhuming corpses for trade with medical schools was a common practice. This was further complicated by the fact that the Scottish legal system had a giant loophole in that disturbing a grave was an offense, as was taking property from the deceased, though stealing the body itself was not illegal, as the body was not the property of any living person. So these resurrection men were risking little criminally and gaining a high profit. It became such a problem that by 1820, the residents of Edinburgh had began protesting in the streets. People began to use hired help to watch graves. Others built watchtowers in cemeteries, and some families purchased large stone slabs to be placed over a grave to keep loved ones from being disinterred. Others used a large iron cage that was placed around a coffin called a mort safe to keep grave robbers from being able to remove the corpse. Soon, the work of locals was successful. Anatomists were thrown into a crisis because of the shortage of corpses. And soon, two men, William Burke and William Hare, took it to what Tim Marshall described as the logical next step, saying, quote, "Instead of digging up the dead, they accepted the lucrative incentives to destroy the living." William Burke was born in 1792 in Ireland. Burke was born into a middle-class family, being raised with his brother in a comfortable childhood, and eventually the two joined the British Army when they were teenagers. He served until he met and married his wife, though the marriage was short-lived, and after an argument with his father-in-law over land, Burke abandoned his wife and family. He left Ireland and moved to Scotland, where he became a laborer. He then met Helen McDougall and married her. The couple moved to Edinburgh in November of 1827, where they sold secondhand clothes to poor locals. Though it wasn't profitable enough, Burke became a cobbler and found success making upwards of £1 a week. He was known locally as an industrious and good-humored man. He would often sing and dance for his clients. He was a religious man, and many noted that he was rarely seen without a Bible. William Hare was likely born in Northern Ireland, though the location and year of his birth are unknown. There's little known of his early life. When he was arrested in 1828, he gave his age as 21, though other sources have noted he was born between 1792 and 1804. He likely worked as an agricultural laborer before traveling to Britain. He moved to Edinburgh in the mid-1820s, where he worked as a coalman's assistant. He lived with a man named Lodge and his wife Margaret. It's rumored that when Lodge died in 1826, that Hare may have married Margaret, though there's no legal record of the marriage. He was described as illiterate and uncouth, quarrelsome and violent, in general an immoral character with scars across his face. In 1827, Burke and his wife went to work on the harvest where they met Hare. The men became friends, and when Burke and his wife returned to Edinburgh, they moved into Hare's lodging house, where the couple soon acquired the reputation of loud drunks. On November 29th of 1827, Donald, a lodger in the Hare house, died shortly before receiving an army pension, while owing Hare £4 back rent. Hare told Burke of his financial loss, and the pair came up with a morbid plan. They would sell Donald's body to one of the local anatomists for a profit. A coffin was provided by a local parish, and Donald was buried. Hare and Burke waited until the carpenter who buried the man left. They opened the coffin and removed the body. They hid the corpse under a bed and filled the coffin with bark before resealing it. After dark, they took the corpse to Edinburgh University to look for a purchaser. According to Burke, they too were looking for Professor Monroe, but a student sent them to Knox's office in Surgeon Square. While the men never discussed the price directly with Knox, it was Knox who determined he would pay a fixed price of £7. Hare took £4 and Burke took £3 to cover the loss from Donald's unpaid rent. In Burke's confession, he explained that the student who saw them off told the men that they, quote, would be glad to see them again when they had another body to dispose of. And so began the series of murders at the hands of Burke and Hare. Burke made 2 confessions, but gave different sequences for the murders. Thus, the order has long been contested. Most agree that the first murder was in January or February of 1828, and was either that of a miller named Joseph, who was lodged at the Hare house, or Abigail Simpson, who was a salt seller. Joseph was suffocated with a pillow. Some say the miller was likely the first because he was delirious with a fever, and that the Hares were concerned that he would be bad for business. Hare and Burke provided Joseph some whiskey before Hare suffocated him, and Burke lay across his chest to restrict him. They took the body to Knox, who this time paid £10. Some have noted how inventive their method was. With Burke's weight on the victim's chest, the victim could not move or make noise, and it prevented them from taking in any air, making Hare's suffocation more efficient. Experts have mentioned that the method would have been undetectable until the modern era of forensics. While the first victim was believed to be suffocated by a pillow, later victims were believed to be suffocated by Hare holding his hand over their nose and mouth. Abigail Simpson and an English lodger from Cheshire were next. Simpson was a pensioner who came to Edinburgh to supplement her pension by selling salt. On February 12, 1828, she was invited to the Hare house and given enough alcohol to ensure she was too drunk to go back home. They stored her body in a tea chest before selling it, and Knox mentioned his approval of the freshness of the body, but didn't ask any questions. The Englishman was selling matches and tinder before falling ill with jaundice at the Hare's house. Hare again feared that he would hurt business, and they used the same methods as before. In either February or March, an old woman was invited to the house by Margaret. She gave her enough whiskey to put her to sleep. When Hare came home that afternoon, he covered the sleeping woman's mouth and nose with a mattress cover before leaving her body. She was dead by nightfall, and Burke helped Hare transport the woman's body to Knox, who again paid £10. By early April, Burke met two women, Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. He bought the women alcohol and invited them back to his lodge for breakfast. The three left the tavern with 2 bottles of whiskey, but never made it to the lodge, instead ending up at Burke's brother's home. When his brother left for work, the three finished the whiskey before Patterson fell asleep on the table. Burke and Brown continued talking, but were interrupted by Helen's accusation of them having an affair. Burke and Helen began to fight. He threw a glass at her, cutting her above the eye. Brown told her that she didn't know he was married and left. Helen also left and went to get Hare and his wife. They arrived shortly after, and the two men locked their wives out of the room, then killed Patterson in her sleep. They took her body that afternoon, again in a tea chest, to Knox. This time, the men were paid £8 each for the body, still warm when they delivered it. One of Knox's assistants asked where they got the body, mentioning that he thought he recognized her. Burke quickly explained that the woman had drunk herself to death, and that they purchased the body from a woman in Canongate. Knox was so pleased he stored the body in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting it. When Brown later searched for Patterson, she was told that Patterson went to Glasgow with a traveling salesman. Helen kept Patterson's skirt and petticoats. Later, in 1828, Mrs. Haldane, a woman that Burke described as a, quote, stout old woman, stayed at Hare's house. She drank until she was drunk and fell asleep in the stable. She, like the others, was suffocated and sold to Knox. Several months later, her daughter Margaret also lodged at the Hare house. She met Burke and they drank together heavily. He killed her without Hare's help and put her body into a tea chest before taking it to Knox, where he was paid £8. In May of 1828, an old woman joined the house. She was, as many of the others, intoxicated, and Burke smothered her. Again, Hare was not present. Her body was sold for £10. Then, Effie, a cinder gatherer, who scavenged through bins and trash to find things to sell, was killed. Burke knew her, as she had sold him scraps of leather. He tempted her into the stable with whiskey, and when she was drunk enough, he and Hare killed her. Knox paid the men £10 for the body. Burke found another victim when a woman was being helped back to her home and could not stand on her own. He offered to take her back to the Hare house, where he killed her. The two were paid another £10 from Knox. In June, Burke and Hare killed 2 more lodgers that Burke described as, quote, an old woman and a dumb boy, her grandson. The boy sat by the fire in the kitchen while his grandmother was killed in the bedroom. Burke and Hare then picked up the boy and carried him to the same room where they had just killed his grandmother. Burke later admitted that this murder was the one that disturbed him the most. He said he was haunted by the memory of the boy's expression. The tea chest that they used to transport the bodies was too small for the 2 corpses. They decided to use a herring barrel to move them to Surgeon Square, where they were paid £8 each. In Burke's confession, he described Hare's horse as being unwilling to pull the barrel past the grass market. Hare called a porter with a handcart to help him get the barrel to Surgeon Square, but Hare was so angry about the horse that he shot it dead in the yard when he returned. On June 24th, Burke and Helen left to visit Helen's father. Burke knew that Hare was short on cash and had pawned some of his clothes. When the couple returned, he noticed that Hare was wearing new clothes and had extra money. Burke checked in with Knox, who confirmed that Hare had sold a woman's body for £8. Despite this, Hare denied having sold another body. This led to an argument between the men, which came to blows. Burke and his wife moved out of the Hare house and into his cousin's home 2 streets away. Though the conflict between the men did not last long. In late September or early October, Hare was visiting Burke when Mrs. Ostler, a washerwoman, came to the property to do laundry. The men got her drunk and killed her. Her body was sold to Knox that afternoon. A week or 2 later, one of Helen's relatives, Anne, was visiting. After a few days, the men killed her and sold her body to Knox. Burke later claimed that Hare's wife, Margaret, suggested that they kill Burke's wife, Helen, because they could not trust her, as she was a Scottish woman. Burke refused. Burke and Hare moved on to a more familiar Edinburgh figure, James Wilson, who was an 18-year-old man with a limp due to deformed feet. He was mentally disabled and generally jovial. He lived on the streets and supported himself by begging. In November, Hare lured Wilson into his lodge with the promise of whiskey. Hare sent his wife to get Burke, and the 2 led Wilson into a room. Margaret locked the door. Wilson didn't like to drink heavily, so he was not drunk, as most of the men's victims had been. He was also strong and fought back, though he was eventually overpowered and killed. His body was stripped of his few possessions, some of which Burke and Hare kept for themselves. Of course, the body was sold to Knox, and when Knox's students examined the body the next day, they noticed the corpse's feet and identified the boy as Wilson. Knox quickly denied that it could be him, but when the word that Wilson was missing began to circulate, Knox dissected the body ahead of others that were being held in storage. Knox removed the head and feet before the main dissection. In an eerie Halloween twist, the final victim was killed on October 31st, 1828. Margaret Docherty, a middle-aged Irish woman, was lured into Burke's cousin's home by claiming that his mother had also been a Docherty from the same area of Ireland. The 2 began drinking. At one point, Burke left Margaret with Helen while he went out. He told them it was for more whiskey, though he was really looking for Hare. 2 other lodgers, Anne and James Gray, were an inconvenience to the men, so they paid them to stay elsewhere that night, claiming that a relative had come to stay. They continued drinking into the evening, by which time Mrs. Hare had joined them. Around 9 p.m., the Grays returned to collect clothing for their children, at which time they saw Burke, Hare, their wives, and Margaret drunkenly singing and dancing. And despite the men fighting, at some point that evening, they killed Margaret and put her body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed. The next day, When the Greys returned to the lodge, Anne became suspicious as Burke wouldn't let her go to the bed where she'd left her stockings. When the Greys were left in the house, they searched and found Margaret's body, with blood and saliva on her face. As they were on their way to alert police, they ran into Helen, who tried to bribe them with £10 a week. The couple refused. While the Greys were reporting the murder to the police, Burke and Hare removed the body and took it to Knox. The police searched and found Margaret's bloody clothing under the bed. Burke and his wife, when interviewed, gave different times for Margaret's departure, which raised enough suspicion to take them in for questioning. Early the next morning, police went to Knox's dissecting rooms, where they found her body. James Gray positively identified the woman as the same one he'd seen with Burke and Hare. Hare and his wife were arrested that day, as was the cousin. All denied any knowledge of the murder. The men killed a total of 16 people, and Burke later confessed to both himself and Hare generally being drunk when they killed the victims. He also shared that he could not sleep at night without a bottle of whiskey by his bedside and a candle to burn beside him. When he woke up in the night, he would drink himself back to sleep. It was so bad, he also took up opium to ease his troubled conscience. Robert Christison did the forensic exam of Margaret Docherty, and on November 3rd, 1828, a warrant was issued for the detention of Burke, Hare, and their wives. The cousin was released. The 4 suspects had statements taken. All statements conflicted with the initial answers given when they were first arrested. Christison and William Newbigging determined after examining the body that Margaret was very likely to have been murdered by suffocation, but could not prove it medically. Based on this report, the Burkes and the Hares were charged with murder. Knox was interviewed and asserted that Burke and Hare had simply watched poor lodging houses in Edinburgh to purchase bodies before anyone claimed them for burial. While Christison thought Knox was, quote, deficient in principle and heart, he did not think Knox had broken the law. While the police were sure that murder had taken place and that at least one of the 4 were guilty, they were unsure how they could secure a conviction. They also believed that other murders had been committed, but they had no way to locate the bodies or connect the men to the deaths, as the bodies had already been dissected. Newspapers began to publish lurid and inaccurate stories of the crimes. The public was assuming all missing people were victims of the men. Janet Brown went to the police and identified Patterson's clothing. Another local identified Wilson's trousers being worn by Burke's nephew. On November 19th, a warrant was issued for the murder of Jamie Wilson against the 4 suspects. Sir William Ray, the Lord Advocate, focused on one individual at a time to get a confession on which others could also be convicted. Hare was first, and on the 1st of December, he was offered immunity from prosecution if he turned over King's evidence and provided full details of the murder of Margaret. Because he could not be brought to testify against his wife, she would also be immune from prosecution. Hare made a full confession of all the murders, and Ray decided that was sufficient evidence to prosecute Burke and Helen. Formal charges were brought on the pair for the murders of Patterson, Wilson, and Docherty. Due to a statement by Burke in January of 1829 saying that Knox never encouraged him to kill anyone, Knox faced no charges. Though public awareness brought a cloud to Knox's reputation, many believed he was a sinister ringmaster who Burke and Hare had to do the dirty deed. The murders were so popular that a new word was coined. Burking means to smother a victim or commit an anatomy murder, and soon a rhyme was heard in the streets of Edinburgh. Seeing as I don't have a Scottish accent, I'm going to try my best. Up the close and down the stair, butt and bin with Burke and Hare, Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, knocks the boy that buys the beef. The trial began on Christmas Eve in 1828 before the High Court in Edinburgh's Parliament House. The court was almost immediately full after the doors were opened at 9 a.m., and a large crowd gathered outside the Parliament House. 300 constables were on duty to prevent chaos. The case ran through Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. In the early afternoon, Burke and Helen pled not guilty to the murder of Doherty. The first witness of 55 was called. Not all 55 were called because Knox and 3 of his assistants avoided being questioned in court. Though David Patterson, the main person that Burke and Hare dealt with, was called and confirmed the pair had supplied the doctor with several corpses. In the early evening, Hare took the stand to give evidence. He claimed that Burke had been the singular murderer of Doherty. He also claimed that Helen had twice brought Doherty back to the house after she had run out. Hare admitted only to helping deliver the body to Knox. Then Hare's wife was called. She entered with the couple's baby daughter, who had whooping cough, and she used the baby's coughs to give herself time to think of answers. She told the court that she had a poor memory and could not remember most of the events. Finally, the doctors who had examined the body both said that they suspected foul play, but that there was no forensic evidence to support the suggestion of murder. The defense called no witnesses. At 3 a.m., Burke's defense lawyer began his final statement, which lasted 2 hours. Then Helen's lawyer began to address the jury at 5 a.m. The jury retired to consider the case at 8:30 a.m. on Christmas Day. They returned just 50 minutes later with a guilty verdict for Burke, though they found Helen's guilt not proven. The judge passed the death sentence to Burke, saying, quote, "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomized, and I trust, if it is ever customary to preserve skeletons, yours will be preserved in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." Helen was released and returned home. She went the following day to buy whiskey, but was confronted by a mob who was angry about her not proven verdict. She was taken to police nearby for safety, but the mob seized, and she had to escape through a back window. She tried to see Burke, but was refused and left Edinburgh the next day. On January 3rd, 1829, Burke gave a confession that was more detailed than his pre-trial statement. He placed much of the blame on Hare. On January 16th, a petition on behalf of James Wilson's mother and sister protested Hare's immunity and his forthcoming release from prison. It was given lengthy consideration by the High Court, but was rejected in a vote of 4-2. Margaret was released and went to Glasgow to find passage back to Ireland. While waiting for her ship, she was recognized and attacked by a mob. She eventually headed back to Ireland, though no record exists of her after that travel. On January 28th, 1829, Burke was hanged in front of a crowd of as many as 25,000 people. Some even paid between 5 and 20 shillings to watch from the windows of the tenements nearby. On February 1st, his body was publicly dissected by Professor Monroe at the Anatomy Theater of the university's Old College. Police had to be called when a large number of students gathered, demanding access to the lecture hall, to which only a limited number of tickets had been issued. A small riot ensued. It was calmed only when a professor agreed to allow small groups of 50 to pass through after the dissection was complete. During the 2-hour dissection, Monroe dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, quote, "This is written with the blood of William Burke, who was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School, where it remains. His death mask and book, said to be tanned skin, can be seen at the Surgeon Hall Museum. Hare was released on February 5th, 1829. He had been kept in custody for his own protection. He was assisted in leaving Edinburgh in disguise by a mail coach. At one stop, he was recognized, and word traveled. A crowd surrounded the building, and Hare had to escape. As they threw stones and smashed windows, 100 constables arrived to restore order. In the wee hours of the morning, he was escorted out of town, sent toward the English border, and no reliable sightings of him exist after that day. His eventual fate remains unknown. Knox refused to make a public statement, though many in Edinburgh believe he was culpable in the events. In February, a crowd gathered outside his house and burned an effigy of him. A committee of inquiry cleared him, reporting that they had, quote, seen no evidence that Dr. Knox or his assistants knew that murder was committed in procuring any of the subjects brought to his rooms. Though he resigned from his position as the curator of the College of Surgeons Museum and was gradually removed from the university by his peers. He left Edinburgh in 1842 to lecture in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. While in London, he was debarred from lecturing and removed from the roll of Fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1848. He worked at the Brompton Cancer Hospital as a pathological anatomist until his death in 1862. In another twist of this already absurd tale, in late June 1836, a group of boys went to Arthur's Seat to hunt for rabbits, when they found what has baffled many ever since. In a secluded part of the hill, they found a small rock cave behind 3 slabs of slate. Inside, they found 17 miniature coffins, each with a small body inside. They were arranged into 3 tiers, 2 tiers of 8 and a single coffin on top. The bodies were made of wood, carved and dressed in custom clothes that were stitched or glued around the wood body. The small figures were only 95 millimeters, less than 4 inches. People were baffled by this discovery. Newspapers each took on a different theory. The Scotsman was the first to report the findings and claimed satanic spell manufactory. A month later, the Edinburgh Evening Post proposed that each coffin was representative of a friend or family member who had died in a distant land, as was an ancient custom in Saxony. Another paper suggested it was a superstition among sailors to have their wives give them a Christian burial with an effigy in the case that they be lost at sea. The coffins shifted through private hands before being donated to the Museum of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, and then to the National Museum of Scotland, where they remain today. The museum believes the coffins to be a burial effigy, though they have no clear idea of who or for what. Though there is a theory that overlaps with Burke and Hare's misdeeds. Some believe that the 17 coffins represent the 17 people killed in the series of murders, 16 victims, and then Burke. Rumors swirled that it was Hare's way of coming to terms with his actions, that perhaps he had gone to Arthur's Seat to bury the effigies of the bodies that he'd stolen. And while some have reported seeing what they suspected to be Hare in the area, others argue that 12 of the pair's victims were female, and all the figures were dressed as men. Perhaps they were symbolic of the victims, regardless of gender. Others have suggested that a sympathetic onlooker may have buried the coffins, one for each victim and one for Burke. I had the chance to see the 8 remaining coffins in the National Museum while I was in Edinburgh. They are stunningly small and detailed. There's something inherently mysterious about them. And if they are connected to the Burke and Hare murders, something ironic about their display. The same people whose bodies were stolen to be put on display, to be cut and carved in the name of science, perhaps were then honored by burials of these effigies, only to have those too be disinterred and put on display. What may have been an act of spiritual solace, providing these souls a peaceful burial that they were robbed of, was foiled first by the curiosity of young boys and then the public. Looking at the small wooden pieces, I couldn't help but feel strange about the display, in the same way that I felt uneasy in the surgeon's hall, wondering how many of the bodies on display were procured in unethical ways. I think I've been pretty clear in episodes in the past that while I'm not a religious person, I do believe in more than the physical world. And I can't help but wonder what happens to our souls when our physical bodies are lost to the effects of time or at the hands of another. Do we slip peacefully away from our tangible flesh into another realm, or do we remain, in a way, connected to our physicality? Are these souls forever stuck in the pain of their final moments? I suppose, even if the worst is true, it would be true too for Burke. His body forever on display, representative both of the importance of anatomical study and the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Thanks for listening. We appreciate each of you and love hearing from you. So hit us up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or email us at talesofthe2citiespodcast@gmail.com. And please rate, review, and subscribe on the listening platform of your choice. We're on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, SoundCloud, YouTube, and finally, Spotify. Yay, that one took a while. A big thank you to my friend Ricardo for the music in this episode. And we're a bi-weekly podcast, but if you just can't wait for the next episode, head over to Patreon and pledge for mini episodes and bonus content. And I will say, it is the season for giving, obligatory or not, so head over to TeePublic and check out some of the badass sales on our merch. Again, we appreciate each of you. Thanks for listening. Until next time.